We have conversations about this because that's meeting you where you are, because where you are is you're a thinking being, right? You're a conceptualizing being. You think all the time, right? So we have to start there. We have to meet you where you are. Otherwise I could do what Ramana Maharshi did, which just sit here, and then people start getting weird. Because they don't understand, you know what I mean? People come in, it's an interesting thing when you think about it with Ramana Maharshi, because he did in the beginning just sit in silence, and his teaching was silence. He didn't say that, but his teaching was silence. And so people came to be in his presence, because they want to wake up and they want to be enlightened and all that. And some people would come in his presence and sit in front of him and wake up, they would experience being enlightened, or they would experience self-realization in his presence. Well, that made the other people crazier, right? How come I'm not getting it, right? And then it gets even crazier in terms of some of these transmission concepts that people have, that maybe he stared at that person and he sent the enlightenment, he sent the enlightenment consciousness to that person, but he didn't send it to me, So these things can get crazy, but they only get crazy in the thinking about these things, right? And that's why the more I look at this, the more it becomes evident to me that there's a reason why we say keep it simple. There's a reason why we say just stay with the breath. Just practice that one thing. If you just practice that one thing will be the boat that carries you to the other shore. Now, having said that, the teachings are necessary, the understanding is necessary, but not because the understanding is going to get you there. The understanding is necessary because the understanding is going to motivate you to get there. It's going to motivate you to do the practice. Why? Because the understanding is, if you study the teachings, whether we're talking about the Advaita teachings, non-dual teachings, or any real understanding of what's going on will take you to the same bottom line in terms of what the Buddha said, that it's an inevitable reality that in this situation we find ourselves in, this predicament we find ourselves in, this body that we find ourselves in, this time that we find ourselves in, it's inevitable that this is going to produce suffering because of impermanence, right? And so when you come to that bottom line and it becomes a matter of, okay, is there any way out of this? If there's no way out of this, see, most of humanity is operating from the conclusion that there's no way out of this. Why? Because most of humanity's understanding is that this is all there is. Therefore, there's no way out of this, right? And if you think there is, or if you think that there's something other than the reality that the scientists tell us is the reality, the materialist reality, then you're just kidding yourself. Then you're just you're making yourself susceptible to being conned, because most of the world, everybody knows time is real. Everybody knows that reality is what it is, and that you were born, you're going to live, and then you're going to die. And you're going to get sick, you're going to get old, you're going to have losses, life is unpredictable. That's the world we live in, right? And once that's considered to be all there is, then you're making the best of it, right? Already you're coping, you're making the best of it. You're looking for ways to avoid the confront of being aware of that. You're looking for ways to avoid the confront of being aware of that. I mean, to really take it to the bottom line, you're looking for ways to avoid having to face your own death. That's the bottom line. You're looking for ways to avoid having to face the possible future, the probable future, the inevitable future of getting old, sick, and dying, right? And then between now and then, you're doing everything you can to try and protect yourself from the unpredictability of life, right? Trying everything you can do to protect yourself from the unpredictability of life, and you're doing what the rest of humanity is doing, which is distracting yourself from the truth so you don't have to suffer the recognition of your ultimate demise. And when you see the truth, when you see that there is a possibility, there is a way to deal with this situation, then you can laugh. Then you can laugh. It's actually, human beings are funny. Human beings are comical the way they behave, as if what they're doing makes any sense. So that's why we say in these teachings and practices, this is about going sane. This is about going sane. But before you can go sane, you have to accept responsibility for being insane. So that's the starting point. That's the starting point. It's as simple as that. If you stay out of the thinking process, eventually you'll have to be enlightened, because who you are doesn't think. You're just experiencing the truth. It's as simple as that. How you do that, the focus, the single-pointed focus of attention. So that could be so, and again, the thing that I see about that would be how it works is you're staying out of the thinking process. That's the thing, that's staying out of the thinking process is where all the trouble is, isn't it? Look in your own life, right? When you're upset, isn't it because you're thinking? Yeah, it's all, the thinking process is a process in which as soon as you start thinking, something happens that you don't notice. As soon as you start thinking, the you that's thinking happens, right? And you don't notice it. You don't notice it. You just think you're thinking. But you don't notice that when you're thinking, the you that's thinking is getting brought into existence by thinking, right? And that's the problem, right? Because the you that's getting brought into existence by thinking isn't actually real. It's not actually real. And so its problems aren't real problems. Its existence isn't a real existence. Its conflicts are not real conflicts, because there is not actually a person called I, the identity, the personality. So this can be confusing, right? Say yes. Yeah, this can be confusing because human beings don't know human beings are one-trick ponies, aren't they? When it comes to how to be, right? The way human beings are being is to think, aren't they? Yeah, the way you're being is to think. When you wake up in the morning and open your eyes, your existence occurs as thinking, doesn't it? Yeah, so we're unfamiliar. It's an unfamiliar territory. We're unfamiliar with the reality of who we are. So when we sit and practice meditation, right, to attempt to move out of the thought process and just be aware of the breath and the body, right, occurs to people as something that is hard, occurs to people as something that brings about restlessness, doesn't it? Physical restlessness, mental restlessness. As I said, in the beginning when people learn to meditate, the first thing they say is, oh, this is hard, right? Yeah. So it occurs to people to be hard, right? It's only hard because you're so oriented to thinking that when you stop thinking, the system starts going into, it's like a computer program. When you attempt to stop paying attention to thinking, the system starts going into difficulty in operating. You know what I mean? It starts going into difficulty in operating. And so that registers as restlessness. Something's wrong. That the machine, right, the computer, starts producing an error code. That's the way it happens. Starts producing like a computer error code. Something's wrong here. Something's wrong here. This is not the way things are supposed to be. That's the way the machine starts to operate. But since you're not a machine, it's possible and this is one of the reasons that the teaching is useful and important. It's possible for you to understand that you're not the machine, and therefore you can be the awareness of the machine rather than the machine. And over time, by simply coming out of the software, by simply moving your attention out of the programming into the awareness itself, the programming will gradually, in the beginning it will produce error codes, but it will gradually start to make adjustments to the exposure to awareness. And that we could talk about that in terms of the brain changing, right? Starts to make adjustments, right? But only if you persist. Only if you persist. That's the key. You've got to persist. That the idea you have of a person, right, claims what's happening all the time, right? So you start to have this experience of freedom. You start to have this experience of being at ease and relaxed and have clarity. And then this thought arises, oh, this is really cool. That would be the person claiming the experience. As soon as that happens, it's shut down. Now you're back in the program, right? So this is something that requires practice. You can't, all of the teachings, all of the wisdom teachings tell us you must practice. You're not just going to come out of the water and start breathing. You've got to practice or you'll suffocate, right? Because who you are doesn't have any questions. So you can be sure if you have a question where it's coming from. That's why some of the teachers, like Paul Hederman, used to say, no questions, or one question, right? So it's a concession. That's why a lot of the teachers, like Rupert Spira, entertain questions, because it's a concession. I'll go along with the question and answer thing, because that's what that's what the person wants, and maybe I can convince the ego to relax. That's what Ramesh Balsekar is talking about. Maybe I can, instead of alienating the ego, maybe I can soothe the ego and get it to relax enough, right, for it to realize the truth. See, because once you get into the conceptualization of all this, right, it's inevitably going to lead to all kinds of mental convolutions and questions, and but what about this and what about that, and all that, right? All we have to work with here is concepts, right? So then the thing becomes, can we have useful concepts, right? That's why I like what Ramesh Balsekar does, is he says, I know that what I say is a concept. Any teacher that you listen to is speaking conceptually about what they're. So okay, so let's deal with that in the sense that if we're going to be conceptual, let's see if we can arrive at concepts that have power. Arrive at concepts that can point to a way to make a difference that works. And that's what he does when he starts to talk about no free will and predetermination, because he says, yes, they're concepts, but if you stay with the concept and you work it through, right, where you can see it, you can see how it works, right, that it can be a powerful concept that can lead to freedom, it can lead to liberation, it can lead to helping the ego to relax and accept that the ego need not carry the burden any further. The ego can surrender itself to its source. And once the ego surrenders itself to its source, life gets easy, right? Because you don't have to carry the burden anymore. You don't have to be the one who's worried about whether you're getting it right. You don't have to be the one who, and by the way, the application of this is a very challenging thing, as those of you who have attempted know, right? The application of the idea that there's actually no free will and everything is predetermined. If you really engage with that and look in real time as you're going through life at that, how that works, right? It's a challenging concept to deal with, right? At the same time, if you stay with it and you accept it at the right moments, you can see the freedom that's involved in it, right? What do I mean? If something happens, for example, right? Something happens, and after that thing happens, you're upset. Right? You're upset because, oh, what did I... This is common, is it not, in our lives? Oh, wow, what did I do? What did I do? What was I thinking? How did I do what? Oh, or I screwed up my kids. That's a common one, right? I screwed up my kids. I messed up. I did this wrong. And of course, we live in a world that helps the process along, right? It's perfectly willing to punish you about everything, isn't it? You don't have to do much wrong to get punished in this world, right? So between that reality and the reality that you have in your own superego, right? But if you apply the concept, if you can say, okay, even if this is something I'm still struggling with, let me see, what would it be like if I were to apply the idea that there's no free will, that I didn't do anything, that I can't do anything, that nobody does anything. If I apply that concept specifically to the upset that I was involved in, if I really apply the concept, right, it means I have to let the upset go, doesn't it? Yeah, because whatever I was upset about didn't actually happen. I just thought it happened, right? But it didn't actually happen. Then the question is, okay, if you apply the concept, if you really apply the concept, can you really let it go? Can you really let it go? I was playing with this week at some situations that occurred, right? And it does work, but only if you can really let it go. And in order to really let it go, you have to understand your ability to dismiss a thought. To dismiss a thought occurs, right? This is where mindfulness, this is where the awareness is powerful. A thought occurs, there's an awareness of the thought. The awareness of the thought is such that the thought occurs as an irrational thought. The thought occurs as a thought that is a reactive thought. Upon recognizing that, and upon recognizing that part of this process of thinking is one that will leave me with the burden of being the cause of what doesn't work, upon recognizing that, I simply dismiss it. What's that mean? It means that thought arises, right? And it's just like when you're practicing meditation, a thought arises, but then the habit that we have is we haven't thought about that thought, don't we? Then we haven't thought about the thought about that thought. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. This is usually the way that we're being in the world, isn't it? Thinking upon thinking upon thinking upon thinking, right? But it's possible to recognize a thought that is a thought that is a useless, destructive thought that's going to produce suffering, has no value, and upon recognizing that thought, to simply dismiss it. How do you dismiss it, right? By seeing it for what it is. The same way you would dismiss a mirage. How do you dismiss a mirage, right? When you see that it's a mirage, you no longer seek to get any water from it, right? When you see a thought as a destructive, negative, useless thought, it's like seeing a mirage. You no longer involve yourself with it. You no longer engage with it, right? This goes back to what I was saying in the last class in terms of practicing meditation. When you practice meditation, it's the stillness, it's the unmoving, always available awareness, right, that you're moving attention to out of the thought process, which is a never-ending moving process. And the practice of this over time reorients you to reality. One way of saying this is, we hear sounds, right? We hear sounds, right? Can you hear the silence that the sound's happening in? That's the same thing as the awareness thing, right? Can you be aware of the awareness that the activity is happening in, or that the awareness is manifesting as, right? Well, the answer to that is, no, because I don't have much practice at hearing that, right? I went with a friend of mine a couple of years back to this drumming thing that they did every year at New Year's, right? Where these drumming circles where people would get together, and these one drumming circle group got together in a cathedral, right? And there must have been 100 drummers, right? You can imagine the sound, right, in a cathedral, right? And in the middle of being there, I could hear the sound would be thunderous of all these drums, right? And I could hear the silence. That's the same thing as practicing meditation, such that at any point in time, you can notice the awareness. That noticing of the awareness is noticing your home, is noticing yourself, is noticing that which is not suffering, which doesn't suffer, which can't suffer, which doesn't exist in any other place but now. That's the practice. That's the practice. And what happens is, by doing it formally over time, eventually it starts to bleed into your active life. You start noticing moments. It may just be a moment where you see it, right? And if you see it at a moment when you're in the middle of producing suffering for yourself, that's a real breakthrough, right? If you're in the middle of being crazy and you wake up and you realize that there's nothing happening, you're imagining all this, right? You're imagining all this. This happens very commonly, especially between people who are close to one another, like husbands and wives and boyfriends and girlfriends, right? It's an interesting thing if you pay attention, because this person who loves you and who you love, right? This person who loves you and who you love, that is not interested in doing anything destructive or hurtful to you. That doesn't mean that they won't, right? But that's not their intention, right? And yet, in the right situation, if they push the right button, you will see them as the enemy. Won't you? You'll see them as the enemy. How do you know you're seeing them as the enemy? You'll protect yourself, you'll withdraw yourself, or you'll attack them. That's seeing them as the enemy. Right? If you wake up in the middle of that, it can be a huge breakthrough, because then you realize that you were lost in thought, that you were in a reaction. And when you wake up in the middle of that, you can see that while all this activity is going on, while all this upset is going on, you wake up in the middle of it, and all of a sudden there's calm. There's calm. In the middle of the storm, all of a sudden there's calm. So this is the possibility. That kind of thing will happen if you practice meditation consistently, and if you keep developing deeper and deeper understandings of what these teachings tell us. But I'm interested in you really getting to the bottom line that Ramana Maharshi was trying to get across, which was the silence, which is the awareness that is always there. So rather than get involved in a lot of conceptualization, it's important in the practice of this stuff to simply pay attention to when you're confused, to pay attention to when upset happens, pay attention to when you're lost in thought, or when you're in the default state. In other words, you're ruminating, right? You're worrying. You're in that process. And when you notice that that's what's happening, simply move attention out of the thinking process and notice the awareness that's always there. It's there when you're in the middle of being crazy, the awareness is there. But you're not aware of the awareness at that point, are you? No, you're aware of the thinking and the feeling, right? And the fear and the anger, right? And the need, the compulsion to behave in a way that's going to protect you. The you that doesn't require any protection, because as the good Course in Miracles says, what's real cannot be threatened. Because if you succeed in maintaining your attention on something other than that long enough, right, it'll go down the drain by itself. So it's struggling to stay alive. Yeah. It's struggling to keep your attention. Because as I've said many times before, it's very important to understand that the first step in the process, the first step in the process is to recognize and realize awareness, right? And then the next thing is the battle. After you recognize awareness, then the mind steps in and says, oh yeah? Right? And starts to generate all these thoughts. So what the mind does, the first phase the mind goes into is, okay, not a problem. We're going to get enlightened now. We're going to get enlightened now. So let's learn about enlightenment and let's be enlightened. We're going to get enlightened now. So now the person that's the problem is going to get enlightened. And you don't see it happening, right? Because it's using thinking, right? It's using thinking, and it has you it has the habit pattern play, which is you think you're thinking, and once you're thinking and you think you're thinking, you're in your mind. And then in your mind, you're trying to be enlightened. So it just doesn't happen like that. So ego has information, awareness has wisdom. And wisdom is all intelligence. Ego has limited information and calls that knowledge or intelligence and thinks that that is valuable and powerful, and the proof that that's not true is on the evening news. All right, I want to tell a little story today before we stop. I heard this from the Swami guy I've been hanging out with on the YouTube. I don't know if I'll get it exactly right, but I think I can get the gist of it across. this prince who came, this prince in a royal family was in his 20s, and he was roaming around in the palace, and he came to a storage area, and in the storage area he found this drawing of this female child that was dressed up in this princess outfit. And he said, oh my God, somehow that just touched his heart. He fell 100% in love with this picture of this child who would be his age now, you know. And so he was in love, and he went and told one of the ministers in the palace that he was 100% in love with this princess, and he wanted to marry her, and he would never marry anybody else or be in love with anybody else. So the minister said, well, what are you talking about? Show me what you're talking about. So he took the minister to the storage area and showed him the picture. And he said, that's her. He said, as soon as I looked at her, I felt 100% in love, right? So the minister said, sit down, I got something to tell you. So he sat down and he said, many years ago when your parents were putting on a play for the court, they needed somebody to play the little princess, and they couldn't find a little girl to play the princess. So they figured, well, we'll just dress you up and have you play the princess. So they dressed you up to play the princess, right? And so that picture is a picture of you. So this is a very powerful story if you get the gist of it, right? Because all of that which you fall in love with in the world, right, and you have desire for in the world, if you come to full realization, right, you discover that's you. There's nothing but you. There's nothing but you. So anything that you could love is you. And that's what he came to realize. There was nothing but him. He was in love with himself, right? And when you're in love with another person, you're in love with yourself. If you see it that way, you'll have a real experience of love.